Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
Welcome to On Defense and Security. My name is Katherine Rossy, and I'm the Deputy Director of Research here at the Center. Joining me today is the Center's Director, Dr. Howard Coombs. Dr. Coombs has led a storied career, retiring from full-time duty with the Canadian Armed Forces in 2003, before then transferring to the Canadian Army Reserve, where he continues to serve on a part-time basis. He is currently assigned to the staff of the Commander, Canadian Defence Academy, in the rank of Colonel. Dr. Coombs received his PhD in military history from Queen's University and is currently an associate professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. Howard, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us here today, and I'm sure that our listeners are looking forward to hearing from you.
It's indeed my pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
You've been a CIDP fellow for quite a number of years, and you also served as deputy director before becoming appointed as director of the Center. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of it all and discussing your views on different issues, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about your professional trajectory. So how did you go about serving and leading and commanding in the Canadian Armed Forces to getting a PhD in history and then to now running one of Canada's research organizations on military and defense?
It's a very convoluted path, and a long story which I'll make short for the purposes of this podcast. I originally I'm from Newfoundland, and I went to Memorial University in Newfoundland, and I actually was very involved with the social life at the university, so I was asked to take a bit of a hiatus in my second year. During that time, I had an opportunity to pause and reflect as what I wanted out of the academic environment. At the same time, I transferred to the regular forces and became a regular officer training program officer. They offered to pay my way through university. Okay. So I had a motivation to complete my undergraduate degrees because somebody else was paying for it. So I knew the chance was too good to lose. So I had to be serious about my studies. So I eventually graduated, went into the military. After about 10 years, I was down in the United States. I had the opportunity to pick up a master's degree through the U.S. Army. And then my wife and family were very supportive throughout this whole process. And they said at the end, we're moving back to Canada. And they said, would you consider going back to school part-time and do a PhD? You seem to have enjoyed yourself down here in the United States. So based on the advice of my wife, I applied for Queen's and I was accepted as a part-time PhD student. And eventually a spot came up in the full-time program. And I never thinking that I would be doing this, I decided to retire from the regular Army and embrace full-time PhD studies. And when I finished PhD studies, I was a defense contractor for quite a while, and RMC offered me a position as a professor of history. And at that point in time, I knew some of the researchers in CIDP, and I had become involved in CIDP, and ultimately came for the deputy director. And I said, what the heck? Because of the intersection with defense and security, and because of my background, I thought we all thought it was a good fit. And then the opening came for the director's position, and I was invited to consider filling it. And I have been filling it now. I'm in my second year, and it isn't a straight line. It was just a series of choices that kind of led me to where I am today. And much to my surprise, it wasn't a planned thing. But it's been wonderful, and it continues to be a lot of fun.
It's an incredible story. It's amazing sometimes we look back on what seems now like a straight path, like you've said, and it's just a series of intersecting kind of different decisions and also things we don't decide, right? Things that just kind of fall into place. So that's quite a story.
If you would ask me when I was 17 if I was going to ever do a PhD, I would have laughed in my face.
That's incredible. So let's talk a bit about CIDP. So for the past 40 years or so, CIDP has been really one of the top Canadian research groups that's focused on bridging together academic research and military and defense policy. It also shares close ties, doesn't it, with different institutions around Kingston, the Canadian Defence Academy, RMC, meaning the Royal Military College, where we both teach, Canadian Forces based in Kingston as well. And I think there's over 50 experts here at CIDP, ranging from students and military personnel to former diplomats and government employees and officials. So it's really an incredibly dynamic place to kind of liaise and research and disseminate knowledge, all the while shaping informed policy, in the realms of defense and security. So tell us a little bit more about CIDP. What are its main objectives and areas of focus here at the center?
Well, Catherine, I think you've painted a great context. For me, one of the reasons I've loved being involved with CIDP is it does bridge a gap between policy and practice. In my mind, very few research institutes are able to present an informed, discursive perspective on not only the theory, but also the practice. How do the two link up? How do they connect? There's a joke that I heard many years ago when I was here at Queen's, but it's still very true today. It's basically, it briefs well in theory, but it will never work in practice. So we don't want to hear about the practice. Of interest here for me is the dynamic group of individuals who are all part of CIDP. The discursive research and practice that they do all tends to coalesce into products that are incredibly informed, and they offer perspectives on issues that are of value to Government of Canada, the Canadian military, and an international audience as well. CIDP, I would like to say we focus on certain research areas, but it's very eclectic. Research is here, I would say with CIDP research is a bit of a buffet. It's all connected to policy, but I won't say it's eclectic because it's united by themes.
Right.
We have major areas of research in women, peace, and security. We have CRC chairs that are connected to facets of that topic. We have other researchers who focus on AI and AI in defense, for example, technology, the intersection of technology with the international environment, and how does that translate into outcomes that militaries would try to achieve with advanced technologies such as quantum. We have other people like myself that tend to focus more on the intersection of defense and the practice of operations with strategy, and how does that influence defense policy. And others such as yourself that focus on international organizations and relief efforts. And how does that work in an evolving environment? How has it worked in the past? How does it work now? All these things, however, when we talk about them, they all seem to go in different directions, but they all have a common nexus in that they do influence not only Canadian defense policy, but international defense policy. It also shapes how we as Canadians fit within alliance and coalition, alliances that we're part of like NATO, and coalitions that we may be part of at any given period of time.
So clearly there's a lot of cutting edge research happening here at the center. You mentioned AI and the Women, Peace and Security Initiative as well, for example, Arctic and Maritime Security. And there's so many, like you said, so many different areas that seem to be very diverse, but actually have a common theme and will help inform and shape policy. What are some of the current projects and collaborations underway here at the center?
Well, great question. We were just reviewing some of those very recently. The Kingston Consortium on International Security is one of our flagship cooperative organizations. Right now it includes the U.S. Army War College, NATO Defense College, the Canadian Forces College. We have partnership with the Canadian Defense Security Network, particularly Carleton, which is based out of Carleton. And we do research on broad themes throughout the year. This year it's human security. We all work on our own research fields to produce research oriented towards the idea of human security. And then we present it in an annual conference this year in Kingston from the 19th to the 21st November. And the detailed program will be up fairly shortly, as will be the registration for the conference. So I invite everybody that would like to attend the conference to please sign up and come. It will be held here at Queen's University, and out of that conference, aside from the very unique dialogue that's established at the conference, not just between the presenters and the audience, but on the margins of the conference, in the coffee breaks, amongst the people who are there, who all have a unique background. We have the participants and presenters are practitioners, scholars, students. The audience has serving military, retired military, government officials, corporate officials, people from the Kingston community. So it's just a very unique combination of people with all the different insights on defense and defense policy within this rubric of human security. So that's one. We also, for example, are participating in other networks such as the International Forum for Peace, Security, and Prosperity, which will have a 3-day conference in Palermo, Sicily, in 17th to 20th March. We'll have a number of Queen's interns, CIDP interns will go to that conference with you, our
That's
deputy
right.
director, and participate in this forum, which actually commemorates the operations of the 1st Canadian Division as part of Operation Husky in 1943 and the advance through Sicily. And they're also, this year, they're also working with a human security theme, and the students will be taking the ideas that they work on here and hear about through CIDP, and they will develop them and then presenting them in the research fora that will take place at that conference. So those are just two events that we are participating in, but at the same time, we also are involved in the Canadian Defence and Security Network and other networks of that type, such as the Network for Analytics and Security, or RAS is the French version of that. And we participate in those research efforts as well, collaboratively, of course.
Right. So there's a lot of many exciting things coming down the pipeline in the coming months. You've mentioned now twice, you've mentioned, human security and the changing nature of that in some way. It seems to be a common theme in what we're seeing in a lot of these networks and a lot of these, these symposia and collaborative projects. Maybe we could talk a little bit more generally about Canada and the role you think that Canada plays today in international defense and security. How has this role evolved over the years? What are some of the challenges that we might see in the coming, in the short term?
Well, Canada has an evolving position in regards to where we fit in the international security environment. So if we look in the past, we were members of the British Empire, we took their lead. After the First World War, we started to see an idea of Canadian interests. And when the Second World War happened, we actually debated participation in Parliament, but we did follow the British lead. But I think we emerged from the Second World War with more of a distinct idea that Canada had to have important and vital interests that we needed to advocate for ourselves in the international environment. And that idea of Canada having its own interests and of a vital and important nature has, I believe, continued to develop since then. The difficulty when I look at it, it's the expression of how we engage internationally and what we bring to the table. When we came out of the Second World War, we had very large military. We played a very large role in terms of the international environment, and that continued in the 50s and 60s with how we engaged through the United Nations and through NATO and NORAD. And so we had an influence in the world stage. I would say that in the last 30 years, perhaps maybe 40, that role that we've been playing has diminished for various reasons, to a point right now where I would say, while we have our interests and we advocate for them in the international sphere, we don't have the presence that we had before. So one of the important things I believe that CIDP does is we just have discussions about how Canada engages internationally, how we advocate for our interests, and for the things that we believe are right within the global environment, and how we inject those ideas into the discussions that happen in places like NATO or the UN. We don't have the physical capacity. We don't have the fiscal capacity now to have the same influence we had more than 40 years ago. But at the same time, I do think we have a role to play. And the importance of a researcher like the Center for International Defense Policy is that we help refine the ideas of policymakers and military practitioners in how they engage to advocate for those things that are important to counter, both at home and abroad.
I can definitely attest to that. Just cases alone last year, I was very fortunate to attend that, and just to see, coming together of policymakers and active and retired members of the Canadian Armed Forces and, students and academics, everybody who was there, it really helped me frame my own understanding of the changing world in which we live. You and I are both historians. We can certainly recognize patterns, right? And just looking at war itself, how war has evolved over time and, going in now into the 21st century, when I looked at the early weeks of things like the war in the Ukraine, it almost seemed like we were looking back into the trenches of 1914. People were digging in, fighting trench-style war. But then, it quickly became apparent to me that we're not in the same era at all. These new weapons and technologies, I'm reminded that, the nature of war has fundamentally changed. And it's almost unrecognizable from conflicts past now. It's fought in increasingly kind of hybrid ways, indirect ways, intangible ways. Things like disinformation warfare, and drones, and artificial intelligence, and it's so different now. And this polarized, interconnected world that we live in further complicates things. So we're living in an age where thinking about just the scale of, for example, displaced persons, right? There are more displaced persons in the world today than there were in the aftermath of the Second World War. I think the UN Refugee Agency estimated in 2023 alone, there was something like 117 forcibly displaced persons. And that's not even because of climate change. It's because of things like, persecution and conflict, asylum seekers, internally and externally displaced people. But then you bring things like climate change into the mix, and the devastating impact that has on our populations and how it destabilizes defense and security, around the world. Our oceans and atmospheres are warmer. Canada's Arctic is more accessible than ever, right? It's opened up one of our biggest coastlines to potential exploitation, and it's just not by all kinds of actors. So all of these things together, the increasing number of climate disasters, floods, and wildfires we've seen, the changing nature of war, and all of these things that destabilize human security. I can't think of a more fitting place to have these conversations than here at CIDP, where we bring together all kinds of people, policymakers and politicians, and serving members of the military and academics, to try and come up with solutions and have, to try and chart a path forward, if that makes sense. Because the world we live in is quite, it's very different. I think our cases theme for this year, the changing nature, human security really hits that nail on the head. How do you see the future of things like security and defense policy shaping up in light of some of these recent geopolitical developments and new technologies?
Well, I was very hopeful at the end of the Cold War. I lived through it in uniform, and I thought that there would be a peace dividend at the time. Then all of a sudden, the world exploded in the early 90s, and we haven't the illusion of stability, perhaps, that we had from the Cold War dissipated, and then a lot of intrastate conflict started to occur. Canada became very immersed in operations into conflict-ridden regions or post-conflict areas, trying to bring some degree of stability to those regions. And I thought, with some degree of success, the former superpowers had come to some kind of retrenchment, but then in the new millennia, the fissures that Huntington alluded to, the clash of civilizations, although I know some people think that I'm noting.
I hear you.
Those cultural divides really came in, and religious divides came into play. And today we are seeing a globe that is racked by conflict, intrastate, interstate, huge regions of the world are under extreme tension or violence throughout it. Indo-Pacific, the incredible strategic competition going on there right now, which has the potential to spill over into violent conflict at any time. And that's constantly going back and forth. The Middle East, of course, and Eastern Europe. And so when we look at all of this right now, and how do countries that are not involved in these conflicts try to manage, try to keep the conflict confined to the regions in which they're currently taking, try to ameliorate what's going on in those regions to help the people that are there. I think the set of really complicated problems that countries such as Canada are now presented with are unprecedented. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how the center helps with focusing people on their ideas and how we do these kinds of things. As we move forward as the 21st century advances, I don't see it getting any easier, but I think we do have to figure out better ways to bridge the gaps and divides between peoples and governments so we can have more stability. But what that stability is going to look like, I think it's going to be a very different thing than we conceptualized from the past. It's going to involve governments, it's going to involve transnational groups, it's going to involve organizations like NATO, like the UN. It's also going to involve multinational corporations, to name a few. So those are the actors we need to play with and bring to the table, not just governments. The idea of the Westphalian model, I believe, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so we have to embrace the reality of the situation.
Yeah, we're a long way from 1648, aren't we? I think that makes a lot of sense, and also start thinking about kind of this place on the global stage again, our relationship with our partners and allies. But you make a great point. It's not just about governments. It's about international corporations. It's about international organizations, NATO, the UN, so forth. So
Red Cross
is another one for sure. But it's like you, I don't know what this will look like, but it's clear we're in a very different time. You've had numerous operational deployments. You've deployed to the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Afghanistan as a military officer, and then you also deployed again with Joint Task Force Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011 as a civilian advisor as well. So you've been all over the place. You've jumped out of a lot of planes as well in your day too. So I'm just wondering how your military background, and I think you've already alluded to this quite a bit, but how has your military background influenced your approach to your research or to the way you think about security and defense?
I think if I was to attribute anything to it, it's a pragmatic approach that everything that we do has to be useful. So the research that we conduct here, the papers we publish, this has to help with a tangible outcome. When you do operations, you find that nobody cares what you say, they care what you do, because they're looking for positive effects. I worked, most of those deployments, I worked with non-governmental organizations, international relief organizations, and none of those organizations wanted to normally work with the military. They only worked with the military because it was a marriage of convenience and security and safety. But we had to help each other achieve tangible outcomes for the people that we were trying to protect and assist. And it really brought home to me that you can talk as much as you want, but at the end of the day, there has to be a physical outcome produced. So I think that carries over into how I do my research and how I encourage others to do the research, even here at the center.
So what advice would you give to young people who want to, for example, perhaps are aspiring to work in the CAF or in the fields of defense and security? What advice would you offer to them?
Strangely enough, I just got asked this question by a 15-year-old.
All right.
So a young man bought one of my old duffel bags out of an Army surplus several months ago, and he tracked me down because my name was on it. He tracked me down through the internet, and he actually lives in Peterborough. So we had an online conversation last week where he asked me the same question. What would I do this? And it made me think. Here I am on the with more years behind me than I have ahead of me, and I'm thinking about what I would have done differently. Honestly, I'll tell you the same thing that I told him. Not much. I'd probably do many of the same things that I did. It's been a ride. It's been a journey. It's made me who I am today. It's good times, bad times. However, the one thing I would change, and although it really does, people may wonder why I'm saying it, I would take care of myself better.
Okay.
I would eat better. I would exercise better. I would be more programmed. I probably would never have smoked until my 20s. I probably would have drank less. And I would have just been paying more attention to myself physically and mentally to increase the degree of physical and mental resilience I had to better endure some of the shocks of life along the way. It's analogous to increasing societal resilience, except at an individual level. That would be the only thing I changed. I had a great time in the military. I don't think I would have done the education I would have done if I hadn't been in the Army. The experience that I had in the Army made me a better person in some ways, but at the same time, it helped me gain an understanding of people in a way that I never would have done before. So, in short, I guess I'm one of the few people who say I don't think I changed much except for learning how to take care of myself better at an earlier age.
I think that's sound advice for sure. And I think that was pretty much my last question.
Oh, but
Thank you for joining us today, and it's great to have you here, Howard. Always good to chat.
It's all been my privilege.
Thanks.